Elias Thorne only wanted to pay his docking fee and grab a cheap synthesized coffee. Instead, he accidentally bound his soul to the future queen of a trillion-citizen empire. Xylar Station was a masterpiece of delicate core world engineering, a sprawling hub of spun glass corridors and floating light bridges suspended in the deep void. To the native avian and reptilian species of the inner systems, it was a testament to peace and high culture. To Elias, an independent cargo hauler from the infamous high-gravity death world known as Earth, the station felt like a museum constructed entirely of fragile crystal. His battered freighter, the Iron Horse, looked like a rusted iron anvil sitting among delicate porcelain teacups in the pristine docking bay. Elias himself felt much the same way. He was exhausted, running on 3 hours of sleep, and his heavy, dense bones ached from a long haul across the uncharted outer rim. All he needed was a simple customs clearance stamp. The problem was that Xylar Station was massive. The architectural layout made absolutely no logical sense to a human mind, and the holographic directional signs cycled through 50 different alien dialects, none of which were standard Terran English. Rubbing his tired eyes, Elias wandered out of the bustling commercial sector. He noticed the floors getting shinier and the ambient lighting shifting from a harsh fluorescent glare to a soft, golden glow. The casual crowds of merchants and travelers thinned out, replaced by tall, imposing guards wearing ceremonial armor. Elias assumed he was finally getting close to the central bureaucratic administration. In his experience, the fancier the hallway, the closer you were to the people who collected the taxes. He ignored the guards, and the guards, entirely unfamiliar with the dense, heavy-stepping anatomy of an unarmored human, assumed anyone walking with such casual, heavy-footed confidence past a high-security checkpoint must have high-level clearance. A few corridors away, inside the grand chamber of the diplomatic wing, the atmosphere was thick with impending tragedy. Princess Valia of the Lyran Ascendancy stood rigid before the great altar, her royal silks feeling heavier than battle armor. She was young, fiercely intelligent, and entirely cornered. Across the polished obsidian floor stood General Kalen. He was a warlord from the fractured outer colonies, a massive, imposing figure with cybernetically enhanced limbs and a reputation for absolute brutality. Kalen had spent the last 5 orbital cycles systematically blockading Valia's supply routes and crushing her border defenses. He was not here today to negotiate a treaty. He was here to collect his prize. Kalen's terms were simple and devastating. Valia would marry him, legally transferring supreme command of the Ascendancy's military assets to his control. If she agreed, he would stop the blockade. If she refused, his fleets would bombard her homeworld from orbit by nightfall. It was a flawless political checkmate. Standing between them on the great altar was the biometric registry, an ancient monolith of carved starlight and advanced genetic scanners. It was the physical manifestation of the blood pact. In Lyran culture, a royal union was not sealed with signatures on parchment. It was forged in genetic registry, an absolute, unbreakable foundation of high law. Once a biometric signature was logged into the pedestal, the union was permanent until death. The time for childish defiance is over, Princess. Kalen sneered, his voice a harsh, resonant rumble that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He gestured heavily toward the glowing pedestal. Place your hand on the registry. Give me the fleet, and your people get to survive the week. It is a generous trade. Valia clenched her fists, her mind racing for a loophole, a delay, any possible escape route. Her royal advisors stood off to the side, heads bowed in silent defeat. The chamber was perfectly quiet, the air practically humming with the tension of a dying empire. That was the exact moment Elias Thorne pushed open the massive, gold-inlaid double doors at the back of the chamber. He did not mean to interrupt. The doors were heavy, designed to be opened by ceremonial hydraulic systems. But Elias simply leaned his dense, heavy worlder shoulder against the intricate metal and shoved. The delicate electronic locking mechanism snapped with a sharp crack that shattered the solemn silence of the room. Every head in the grand chamber whipped around. 24 elite royal guards raised their plasma pikes, absolutely paralyzed by confusion. General Kalen turned, his hand dropping to the hilt of his broadsword. Valia blinked, momentarily forgetting her despair as she stared at the strange, grease-stained biped lumbering into the sacred sanctum. Elias did not notice the weapons. He did not notice the royal silks or the warlord. He was entirely focused on the glowing pedestal in the center of the room. To his sleep-deprived brain, the carved monolith looked exactly like the late-fee registry terminals used in the oversized cargo bays of the outer rim stations. He saw a glowing green square on the top, a universal design for a thumb scanner. Finally, Elias muttered under his breath, his deep, gravelly voice carrying easily across the silent room. He walked down the central aisle, his heavy boots thudding against the obsidian floor with a rhythmic, intimidating weight. The guards were so thoroughly baffled by his complete lack of hesitation that no one moved to intercept him. He stepped right between Princess Valia and General Kalen, completely ignoring both of them. Elias looked down at the pedestal. Archaic high Lyran holographic runes floated above the scanner, glowing with a deep, pulsing crimson light. They were ancient warnings detailing the sacred and permanent nature of the blood pact. Elias sighed, assuming it was just another lengthy, unreadable list of bureaucratic terms and conditions regarding his overdue parking fee. He had no time to find a translation matrix. He just wanted to pay the fine, get back to his ship, and sleep for 14 straight hours. Without a second thought, Elias raised his hand, pressed his calloused, grease-smudged thumb directly onto the sacred genetic scanner, and pushed down. The ancient monolith reacted instantly. The soft green glow flashed into a blinding, brilliant gold. A shockwave of displaced air rippled through the chamber, fluttering Valia's silk robes and rattling Kalen's armor. A massive, intricate holographic seal projected high above the altar, illuminating the vaulted ceiling with the emblem of the Lyran ascendancy intertwined with a completely unknown, foreign genetic marker. The automated system of the registry spoke, its voice a booming, resonant chime that vibrated in the chest of everyone present. The translation matrix broadcasted the declaration in the universal trade language so all dignitaries could bear witness. Genetic registry confirmed. The blood pact is sealed. Princess Valia of the Lyran ascendancy is hereby legally and permanently bound in royal union to Elias Thorne of the sector designated Earth. The line of succession is secured. May the stars witness this unbreakable bond. The silence that followed the announcement was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that descended over the room. Elias pulled his thumb off the scanner, frowning down at the machine. He tapped the side of the ancient stone monolith with his knuckles. He looked around the room, finally noticing the horrified faces of the alien dignitaries, the terrified guards, the beautiful woman in silk staring at him with wide, shocked eyes, and the massive, heavily armed warlord whose face was rapidly turning a deep, furious shade of purple. "Machines busted," Elias said casually, addressing the room at large. "It didn't print my receipt. Who do I talk to about getting my docking clamp released?" General Kalen let out a roar of absolute, unhinged fury, drawing a serrated plasma blade that ignited with a blinding white heat. The royal guards finally snapped out of their stupor, their weapons charging with a high-pitched whine as they rushed forward. The entire chamber erupted into absolute, pandemonium-fueled chaos, and Elias Thorne suddenly realized that the cheap synthesized coffee was going to have to wait. The roar of a high-yield plasma blade inside a sacred diplomatic chamber usually guaranteed a severed head. But Elias Thorne just found the high-pitched whining noise deeply annoying. General Kalen lunged across the obsidian floor, his cybernetic legs launching his massive frame forward with lethal speed. To the delicate avian and reptilian dignitaries watching, the warlord was a blur of mechanized death. To Elias, raised under the crushing gravity of a planetary system that actively tried to kill its inhabitants every single day. The warlord was moving like a man wading through thick mud. Elias did not draw a weapon. He simply shifted his weight. His dense, heavy worlder musculature coiled and released in a fraction of a second, allowing him to step casually to the left. The blazing white plasma blade cleaved cleanly through the empty air where Elias's chest had been, violently melting the edge of the ancient stone pedestal instead. Molten slag dripped onto the floor, hissing and spitting. Elias looked at the glowing puddle of rock, then up at the heavily armored warlord. He wiped a smudge of engine grease off his cheek with the back of his hand, entirely unfazed. The absolute lack of a fear response from the human short-circuited Kalen's tactical processors. The general froze, his blade held high, utterly confused by the prey that refused to cower. "You are going to have to pay for that," Elias pointed out, gesturing to the ruined pedestal. "I know how station security gets about property damage." Kalen's face flushed a deep, violent purple. He deactivated the plasma blade and turned his fury toward the royal balcony. He demanded the immediate execution of this filthy primitive and the absolute annulment of the corrupted registry. His voice shook the crystal fixtures of the grand chamber. But before his personal guards could storm the altar, the High Chancellor of the Ascendancy stepped forward. The elderly alien leaned heavily on a ceremonial staff, his feathered crest raised in strict, unyielding defiance. The Chancellor slammed the staff against the floor. The sound resonated with ancient authority. He declared that the law of the stars was absolute. The blood pact was forged by the founders, woven into the very genetic code of the Empire. To murder a royal consort outside of the sacred, perilous trial of ancestors would not only invalidate Kalen's political standing, but would plunge the entire sector into a holy war. The machine had accepted the human's biometric signature. The marriage was legally binding, and the human was now untouchable by conventional military law, while the warlord screamed obscenities at the Chancellor. Valia's royal physician discreetly raised a handheld medical scanner, aiming the invisible beam directly at Elias's back. The physician tapped the screen, waiting for the biological breakdown of this unknown, unarmored creature. When the holographic readout populated, the physician physically recoiled, dropping the scanner with a loud clatter. Princess Valia hurried over to her trembling advisor, snatching the device from the floor. She read the glowing blue data streams, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. The readout identified the creature's origin as Earth, a Class 9 classification. In the Galactic Registry, a Class 9 was a quarantined death world, a planetary anomaly boasting crushing gravity, savage weather patterns, and an atmosphere filled with highly volatile oxygen. But the physiological data was what truly terrified her. The human skeletal density was comparable to starship-grade durasteel. His muscle fibers were tightly packed cords designed to fight against an oppressive gravitational pull every second of his life. Most alarming of all was his endocrine system. The scanner detected glands capable of flooding his bloodstream with epinephrine, a natural, highly restricted combat stimulant that would cause any Lyran heart to explode within seconds. To the galactic community, Elias Thorne was not a simple freighter captain. Biologically speaking, he was a walking siege engine. Valia looked from the scanner to the grease-stained man casually stretching his neck muscles near the altar. A brilliant, desperate strategy ignited in her mind. General Kalen would never accept a political defeat. He would send assassins, mercenaries and poisoners to eliminate the human and clear the path to the throne. But how could anyone successfully assassinate a creature whose liver could likely process industrial coolant and whose bones could stop a standard kinetic round? Without a word of warning, Valia marched across the altar, grabbed Elias by the collar of his heavy canvas jacket, and hauled him toward a private antechamber hidden behind the royal tapestries. She expected him to follow easily, but pulling him felt like trying to drag a bolted-down cargo drone. Elias sighed, offering no resistance as he lumbered after her, allowing himself to be pulled into the dimly lit, soundproofed room. The heavy stone door slid shut, cutting off the shouts of the Senate. Valia spun around to face him, her royal silk shimmering in the low light. She locked eyes with him, her expression a mix of regal authority and absolute desperation. She explained the reality of the situation in rapid, sharp sentences. She told him about the warlord's blockade, the forced marriage proposal, and the military coup threatening to tear her civilization apart. She bluntly informed him that his little accident with the scanner had just painted a massive, glowing target on his back. Kalen would not rest until Elias was dead, and the warlord had the wealth of a dozen star systems to fund the hit. Elias crossed his arms, leaning back against the cold stone wall. He listened patiently, his face impassive. When she finished, he rubbed the back of his neck, letting out a long, heavy breath. He explained that he had an ex-wife back on a Martian mining colony. The divorce had cost him his favorite hoverbike, and he had made a firm, personal vow never to get married again. He turned toward the door, stating he would just take his chances with the warlord's assassins on his way back to the docking bay. Valia moved fast, blocking the exit. She recognized the pragmatic, survival-driven nature of a Deathworlder. Appeals to high morality or interstellar politics would not work. She needed currency. She quickly accessed the station's public financial network using her wrist console. Scanning the Port Authority records for a ship registered to an Elias Thorne, the holographic projection hovered between them, displaying the registration for the Iron Horse. The ship was heavily modified, highly illegal in 6 sectors, and burdened with a mountain of predatory banking guild debt that would take 3 lifetimes to pay off. Valia looked him directly in the eyes, her voice dropping to a smooth, calculated whisper. She offered him a tense, highly classified bargain. She needed him to play the role of her devoted, terrifyingly dangerous husband until her official coronation next week. She needed a biological shield, an unkillable deterrent to keep Kalen's assassins at bay while she secured the loyalty of the inner system fleets. If he survived the week and protected her, she would quietly use the royal treasury to completely vaporize the debt on his starship. Furthermore, she would grant him a Class A, unrestricted trade license for the entire Lyran ascendancy. Elias stared at the holographic debt numbers floating in the air. Those numbers had kept him awake in his cramped bunk for the last 5 years. He looked at the princess, noting the genuine fear hiding just beneath her fierce, royal posture. A profound moral lesson often found its way into the cold vacuum of space, usually disguised as simple, shared survival. She was trapped by her duty, and he was trapped by his poverty. Together, they had a fighting chance. Elias reached out, turning off her wrist projector with a tap of his heavy finger. He straightened his posture, seemingly growing another 2 inches in height, and gave her a sharp, predatory grin that sent a primal shiver down her spine. For a Class A license, he told her, he would be the most terrifyingly devoted husband this side of the galactic core. They stepped back out into the grand chamber. The argument between Kalen and the Chancellor was still raging, but it stopped the moment the heavy stone doors hissed open. Elias did not walk out like a lost, tired mechanic. He walked out like an apex predator stepping into a territory dispute. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic swagger, his boots slamming against the floor with deliberate, intimidating force. He bypassed the guards, ignoring their raised weapons, and walked straight up to General Kalen. The warlord towered over the human, his cybernetic armor humming with power. But Elias stepped entirely into Kalen's personal space. He looked up at the warlord, his eyes cold and dead. Elias did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his greasy jacket and spoke in a low, gravelly tone that carried clearly through the silent room. He mentioned that where he came from, disputes over a man's wife were usually settled with rusty mining equipment in a dark alley, and he was very eager to see how the warlord's fancy metal limbs would hold up against a heavy-duty plasma wrench. Kalen stared down at the unarmored alien. He scanned Elias for energy shields, hidden blasters, or defensive subdermal plating. He found absolutely nothing. The human was completely exposed, yet his heart rate was steady, his breathing was calm, and his eyes held the quiet, terrifying promise of absolute violence. Kalen felt a cold, entirely unfamiliar sensation creep up his spine. It was uncertainty. The warlord sneered, taking a single, deliberate step back. He declared that a legal technicality would not save a doomed kingdom. He promised Xylar that this primitive creature would be dead before the great eclipse, and he promised Elias that his death would be studied in medical academies for generations. Kalen turned on his heel, his heavy cape billowing behind him, and stormed out of the chamber with his elite guard in tow. The political crisis was momentarily averted, but the silence in the room was heavier than before. Everyone stared at the human who had just successfully bluffed the most dangerous warlord in the quadrant. Xylar stepped to his side, letting out a breath she felt she had been holding for an eternity. Elias turned to his new royal wife, the adrenaline slowly fading from his system, leaving him painfully aware of his exhaustion and his profoundly empty stomach. He casually asked if the royal palace had a decent kitchen, because sealing a blood pact always made him crave a very large, incredibly unhealthy sandwich. Surviving a warlord's plasma blade was one thing, but navigating a room full of politicians in 0.4 gravity was a completely different kind of death sentence. Elias Thorne was rapidly discovering that high society was far more dangerous and infinitely more annoying than the cold vacuum of deep space. To legitimize the sudden and highly unorthodox blood pact in the eyes of the Interstellar Council, Princess Xylar had to present her new husband at the Grand Equinox Gala. It was the social event of the orbital cycle, a lavish gathering of planetary governors, trade barons, and military elites held in the Starlight Pavilion. The pavilion was a masterpiece of delicate core world architecture, an enormous dome constructed of spun glass and floating platforms suspended within a localized anti-gravity bubble. To the hollow-boned avians and slender reptilians of the Ascendancy, it was a paradise of effortless elegance. To Elias, it was an absolute nightmare. He had spent his entire life fighting the crushing, unforgiving gravity of Earth. His dense skeletal structure and heavy musculature were designed to keep him anchored to the ground. In the pavilion's artificially low gravity, he felt like a runaway cargo container. Every step required intense, agonizing concentration. A normal stride threatened to launch him straight into the floating crystal chandeliers. He had to lock his joints, shuffle his heavy boots along the polished floors, and move with the deliberate, agonizing slowness of a predator stalking through a dry forest. Adding to his misery was the formal attire Xylar's royal tailors had hastily assembled. The dark, iridescent synth silk tunic looked sharp and authoritative, but it felt like tissue paper stretched over a boulder. He was terrified that flexing his shoulders would rip the garment entirely in half. "Breathe, Elias," Xylar whispered, gliding effortlessly beside him in a gown of woven starlight. She linked her arm through his, ostensibly to show the gathered elite their profound royal affection, but practically to help anchor him to the floor. You look incredibly intimidating. Just do not break anything. I make no promises, Elias muttered through a forced diplomatic smile, his deep voice barely carrying over the ambient hum of the string orchestra. Everything in this room looks like it was made out of sugar glass. I just crushed a hors d'oeuvre platter with my thumb because I tried to pick up a tiny, blue cube of whatever that was. That was imported Tyrian caviar, Valia replied, her eyes scanning the crowd with a practiced, calculating grace. And you handled it beautifully. Now keep smiling. The Minister of Trade is watching us from the floating mezzanine. Elias offered a tight nod to the mezzanine, focusing entirely on not floating away. He played the part perfectly. To the gathered dignitaries, the heavy worlder was a terrifying enigma. He moved with a slow, coiled lethargy that they misinterpreted as the supreme, arrogant confidence of an apex predator. The way he loomed over the fragile politicians, his broad shoulders blocking the ambient light, sent ripples of nervous whispers through the crowd. He was exactly the biological shield Valia needed. But across the expansive ballroom, hidden in the shadows beneath a decorative waterfall of liquid helium, General Kalen's operatives were preparing to test that shield. They were two slender insectoid mercenaries, their natural carapace blending perfectly with the dark velvet drapes. They knew better than to attempt a kinetic strike in a room filled with royal guards. Instead, they relied on chemistry. They held a tiny, pressurized vial of Xylaxian nerve rot, a highly classified, heavily restricted military neurotoxin. It was a synthetic compound engineered to completely dissolve the vascular system of any carbon-based life form in under 10 seconds. There was no known antidote. Waiting for the perfect distraction, the operatives intercepted a hovering serving drone. With practiced precision, they injected the clear, odorless liquid directly into a tall crystal glass of ceremonial wine destined for the human consort. A few moments later, the drone floated up to Elias and Valia, offering a tray of beverages. Elias, desperate for anything to alleviate the profound boredom of political small talk, reached out with agonizing slowness and pinched the stem of the crystal glass between his thick fingers. Valia raised her own glass, turning to him with a genuinely warm smile. To survival, husband. To paying off my ship, Elias corrected softly, clinking his glass against hers with a gentle, terrifyingly precise tap. He brought the glass to his lips and took a deep drink. The liquid hit his tongue, and Elias paused. It burned. It tasted intensely bitter, reminiscent of cheap engine degreaser mixed with fermented ghost peppers. But Elias was from Earth. His liver was an evolutionary marvel, an organ forged by millennia of his ancestors routinely consuming toxic alkaloids, highly acidic fruits, and literal poisons simply for the recreational thrill of it. As the Xylaxian nerve rot entered his bloodstream, his highly aggressive heavy worlder immune system immediately identified the foreign synthetic compound. A massive, instantaneous wave of human enzymes flooded his system, brutally breaking down the deadly neurotoxin into harmless amino acids before it could even reach his heart. Elias did not collapse. He did not bleed from his eyes. His vascular system did not dissolve. He simply blinked, feeling a pleasant, intensely warming sensation spread rapidly through his chest, accompanied by a slight, euphoric rush of adrenaline. He lowered the glass, smacked his lips, and looked at the remaining liquid with genuine appreciation. He downed the rest of the wine in one massive gulp. Elias placed the empty crystal glass back onto the hovering drone tray with a heavy clack, wiping a drop of purple liquid from his chin. He looked toward the bar across the room and raised his voice slightly. Finally, I have to commend the bartender. Everything else on this station tastes like filtered water, but this stuff actually has a decent kick to it. Beneath the liquid helium waterfall, the two insectoid assassins stared in paralyzed, absolute dread. Their multifaceted eyes widened as they watched the human casually digest enough military-grade nerve rot to kill a herd of armored battle mounts, only to immediately look around the room for a refill. It defied every known law of biology. They quietly holstered their weapons and melted back into the shadows. Utterly terrified of the indestructible demon the princess had bonded herself to. Xylar had watched the entire exchange. She had seen the microscopic puncture mark on the drone's tray, recognized the faint, oily shimmer of the toxin in his glass, and realized with a sickening jolt of panic that she was a fraction of a second too late to knock the drink from his hand. She had braced herself for the gruesome reality of his death. When he simply smiled and praised the flavor, the sheer, absurd reality of his existence truly anchored itself in her mind. She pulled him away from the crowded center of the room, guiding him out onto a secluded, cantilevered observation deck. The ambient noise of the Gala faded behind the thick, soundproofed glass doors. They stood together in the quiet cool of the deck, looking out over the sprawling, illuminated rings of the space station. Xylar looked up at him, studying the rough, uneven lines of his face. He was built for a universe that actively wanted to crush him. Yet he had spent the last 2 hours being agonizingly, painstakingly careful not to step on the trailing hems of the dignitaries' gowns. A profound realization washed over her. True strength was not merely the capacity for immense violence. True strength was the absolute, disciplined control over that violence. He could easily tear the pavilion apart with his bare hands. But he chose to be gentle so that he would not break the fragile world she loved. "You are a remarkably strange creature, Elias Thorne," Xylar said softly, the formal royal cadence dropping from her voice, replaced by genuine warmth. Elias leaned his heavy forearms against the reinforced railing, carefully testing its weight capacity before relaxing. "I'm just a guy trying to clear a debt, princess, though I will admit the catering here is starting to grow on me." She laughed, a quiet, bell-like sound that seemed to cut through his exhaustion. The fake marriage, born of desperate political necessity, was suddenly beginning to feel like a very real, very dangerous partnership. But as they looked out the massive viewport, the light from the system's twin suns began to shift. A massive, dark shadow slowly began to creep across the station's outer hull. The great orbital eclipse was beginning, a rare celestial alignment that would soon plunge the entire station into temporary, absolute darkness. In the lower security sectors, the automated sensors were already beginning to fail, blinding the Royal Guard's surveillance grid. General Kalen was not a man who accepted failure, and his silent killers would not miss a second time. The shadow of the great eclipse did not merely steal the light from Xylar Station, it brought the cold, silent promise of an execution. When the twin suns vanished behind the gas giant, the station's primary automated defense grid went completely blind, plunging the gleaming corridors of the royal wing into a thick, artificial twilight lit only by dim crimson emergency strips. General Kalen had planned this breach with ruthless precision. Frustrated by the biological resilience of the human, the warlord decided to abandon political subtlety entirely. He deployed the Wraith Squad, an elite unit of cybernetically enhanced killers equipped with highly classified, light-bending camouflage technology. They were ghosts in the physical world, completely invisible to standard thermal optics and digital motion trackers. As the eclipse disabled the station's security feeds, the Wraiths bypassed the heavily armed but technologically reliant Royal Guards with effortless, terrifying ease. Deep inside the heavily fortified inner sanctum, Xylar paced the polished stone floor, anxiously monitoring the failing sensor readouts on her central console. Elias sat on a reinforced synth leather couch, rolling up the sleeves of his ruined ceremonial tunic. The crushing gravity of Earth had taught his ancestors a very harsh lesson about survival. When the lights went out, the real monsters came hunting. He did not look at the useless holographic security feeds. He closed his eyes, tuned out the hum of the station's life support, and simply listened. 4 invisible killers slipped through the locked blast doors using military-grade frequency decoders. They made absolutely no sound that a Lyran ear could detect. But Elias was not Lyran. His inner ear structure was a biological marvel, an evolutionary mechanism forged by 1,000,000 years of dodging apex predators in dense, dark jungles. He heard the microscopic displacement of air near the entryway. He heard the faint, high-frequency whine of active camouflage fields struggling to adapt to the fluctuating red emergency lights. Most importantly, he felt the incredibly subtle shift in the floor plates beneath his heavy boots as foreign weight entered the room. Elias opened his eyes. He commanded Valia to get down, his voice a sharp, commanding whip crack that shattered the silence of the sanctum. He did not wait for the princess to process the order. Elias lunged forward, his dense, heavy worlder musculature propelling his massive frame across the room with explosive speed. He shoved Valia violently behind the solid rhodium command desk, just as 4 blazing plasma blades ignited from thin air. Cutting through the exact space where her head had been a fraction of a second prior. The assassins fanned out instantly, their cloaking fields rendering them as nothing more than faint, shimmering ripples in the dark room. They expected the heavy worlder to draw a blaster, to rely on targeting computers that their armor could easily jam. Instead, Elias grabbed the nearest object he could find. It was a ceremonial solid obsidian statue of the first Lyran emperor, an artifact weighing easily over 200 pounds. To Elias, operating in the low gravity of the station, it felt like a slightly heavy throwing stone. He spun on his heel and hurled the priceless artifact directly at the nearest shimmer. The obsidian emperor collided with the invisible assassin with devastating kinetic force. The impact shattered the cloaking generator instantly and sent the killer crashing backward through a reinforced glass partition. Elias did not stop moving. He grabbed a massive, ornate dining table made of dense ironwood, flipping it entirely upside down to use as a mobile barricade. The remaining 3 wraiths slashed at the wood, their plasma blades searing deep, glowing trenches into the barrier. But the thick, ancient timber absorbed the initial heat. Elias kicked the table forward, pinning one assassin brutally against the stone wall. He reached over the top of the splintered wood, his massive hand closing around the killer's cybernetic wrist. With a simple, ruthless twist, he snapped the weapon arm entirely backward, disarming the wraith before tossing the armored operative aside like a broken piece of machinery. The 2 remaining assassins realized they were fighting a creature that fundamentally ignored the established rules of elegant, high-tech combat. They coordinated their attacks seamlessly, flanking the human from both sides in perfect synchronization. One assassin fainted high, drawing Elias's attention, while the other dropped low and lunged directly toward the rhodium desk where Valia was taking cover. Elias saw the lethal strike aimed directly at the princess. He had absolutely no time to throw a heavy weapon or cross the distance to intercept the blade with his hands. He made the only tactical choice available. He threw his own body directly into the path of the glowing energy weapon. The searing blade of plasma carved a savage, glowing trench across his left shoulder, slicing cleanly through his thick jacket and biting deeply into his flesh. The pain was absolute, a blinding flash of pure thermal agony. But the human adrenal gland was a terrifying biological mechanism. The severe injury triggered a massive, instantaneous surge of natural combat stimulants into his bloodstream. Elias completely ignored the burning wound. He reached out and grabbed the assassin by the armored throat, lifting the killer entirely off the floor with one arm. He slammed the operative down against the stone tiles with enough force to shatter the floorboards and knock the wraith completely unconscious. The final assassin, witnessing the heavy worlder take a lethal plasma burn only to respond by moving faster and hitting exponentially harder, made a rapid tactical calculation. The killer instantly deactivated his blade, triggered his jump jets, and fled backward into the dark ventilation shafts. The room fell dead silent, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the human and the acrid hiss of scorched fabric. The eclipse slowly began to pass, and the bright, artificial daylight of the station filtered back through the shattered windows, illuminating the wreckage of the royal sanctum. Xylar slowly stood up from behind the desk, her flawless royal composure entirely shattered. She looked at the destroyed room, the incapacitated elite assassins groaning on the floor, and finally at Elias. He was leaning heavily against the stone wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his jaw clenched incredibly tight. Xylar rushed to his side, retrieving an emergency medical kit from a hidden compartment in the wall. She ordered him to sit down, her hands trembling as she carefully cut away the ruined fabric of his shirt to expose the burn. The wound was horrific, but his impossibly dense muscle tissue and thick skin had miraculously stopped the plasma blade from reaching the bone. She applied a thick, cooling layer of synthetic dermal foam to the burn. As she worked, she looked up into his face. He was clearly in immense pain, but his eyes were entirely focused on the ventilation shaft, still guarding her against a potential secondary strike. A profound realization settled over her, sweeping away the cold logic of their political arrangement. Her entire life had been defined by calculated alliances, constant betrayals, and powerful people using her for access to the throne. General Kalen viewed her strictly as property. The Galactic Council viewed her merely as a stabilizing asset. Elias Thorne, a grease-stained cargo hauler from a quarantined death world, was the only person in the entire galaxy who had ever simply stood in front of a blade for her. He was an outsider, a terrifying force of raw physical nature. Yet his rough, calloused hands possessed a profound, protective loyalty that no Lyran noble could ever understand. "You are actually bleeding," Xylar whispered, the sheer reality of his mortality suddenly grounding her. Occupational hazard of the fake marriage business. Elias grunted, forcing a tight, reassuring smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Though I am definitely adding a medical hazard pay clause to our contract when this is over." Xylar secured the bandage, her fingers lingering slightly against his warm, undamaged skin. The shared danger had violently stripped away the royal titles, the political maneuvering, and the massive species barrier, leaving only a quiet, intensely charged tension between them. But the delicate moment was instantly shattered when Elias noticed a small, blinking data drive protruding from the shattered wrist gauntlet of the unconscious squad leader lying near the desk. He reached down and pulled it free, turning the metallic chip over in his massive hand, his expression darkening. General Kalen was a warlord, a man of brute force and stolen military might. He did not have the technical infrastructure or the vast wealth required to manufacture these specific, highly encrypted military-grade cloaking drives. Someone with deep, systemic access to the galactic core was actively funding this coup, providing the warlord with untouchable technology. The real war was not just against a rogue general. It was against a hidden enemy deeply embedded in the financial heart of the Ascendancy, and the answers were locked tightly inside the tiny piece of metal he now held. A tiny piece of metal was about to expose a treason so vast it could bankrupt a trillion-citizen empire. Or, if Elias and Xylar were not fast enough, it was going to get them both permanently vaporized. Xylar took the blinking data drive from Elias's bloodied hand and slotted it into an isolated, standalone terminal hidden beneath her ruined rhodium desk. Her fingers flew across the holographic interface, bypassing the standard military encryptions with the practiced ease of a royal who had grown up surviving daily corporate espionage. The screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving green. Cascading columns of financial ledgers, hidden shipping manifests, and classified weapon requisition forms flooded the air. Elias leaned over her shoulder, ignoring the throbbing pain of the plasma burn. He could not read the High Lyran text, but he recognized the universal structure of a massive black market payoff. Valia's breath caught in her throat. She pointed a trembling finger at the crest embedded at the top of the transaction logs. It was not the insignia of a rival warlord or a rebel faction. It was the golden, stylized scales of the Galactic Banking Guild. General Kalen was not acting alone. A deeply corrupt, vastly powerful faction within the guild was secretly funding his military blockade and supplying his assassins. Their ultimate goal was brutally simple. They wanted Kalen to force the marriage, stage a coup, and plunge the ascendancy into a highly profitable civil war. The guild would then swoop in, offer predatory loans to rebuild the shattered empire, and effectively own the Lyran civilization for the next 1,000 years. It was a flawless execution of political and financial warfare, but presenting a stolen, unverified drive to the Interstellar Council would be useless. The guild's lawyers would immediately dismiss it as a fabricated forgery. To permanently sever Kalen's funding and expose the conspiracy, they needed the master decryption key, which was only stored in the guild's local mainframe. Valia shut down the terminal and grabbed a dark, hooded civilian cloak from her emergency supplies. She tossed a heavy canvas mechanic's coat to Elias. If they used the royal elevators or requested an official guard escort, the guild's spies would instantly delete the mainframe. They had to disappear. They had to descend into the deep, unregulated lower levels of Xylar Station where diplomatic immunity meant absolutely nothing. The descent was a plunge into an entirely different universe. The pristine glass corridors and floating light bridges of the upper decks vanished, replaced by grinding metal walkways, flickering neon signage, and the oppressive damp heat of massive atmospheric scrubbers. This was the domain of smugglers, rogue mechanics, and bounty hunters. Elias felt his tense shoulders finally relax. The air tasted metallic and heavy, exactly like the lower decks of an Earth orbital shipyard. For the first time since arriving on the station, he felt completely at home. Valia, however, was terrified. She kept her hood pulled low, clutching Elias's uninjured arm as they navigated the crowded, dimly lit alleys. She was a creature of high diplomacy, entirely unequipped for the raw, desperate reality of her own station's underbelly. A profound lesson in leadership struck her as they walked past destitute citizens rationing synthetic protein bars. A ruler who only knows the view from the palace can never truly understand the weight of the crown. They reached Sector 4, a massive cavern of humming servers and cooling towers. The secondary banking node was a fortified, windowless cube of solid neutronium nestled between two roaring plasma conduits. There were no organic guards, only an array of automated, highly lethal turret systems. Valia produced a localized frequency scrambler, rendering the turrets blind for exactly 3 minutes. They sprinted to the primary access terminal beside the massive vault door. Valia connected her wrist console, slicing through the outer firewalls with desperate speed. The decryption key was right there, floating in the digital ether. She initiated the download, a brilliant blue progress bar filling the air. Then, the terminal violently flashed red. A silent, hidden tripwire in the guild's code recognized the unauthorized download. The alarm did not ring out. Instead, the station's heavy security protocols engaged a brutal, physical failsafe. A deafening mechanical groan echoed through the cavern as a secondary emergency vault door. A slab of solid durasteel 3 feet thick dropped from the ceiling perfectly between them and the terminal. Valia scrambled backward, gasping as the massive hydraulic locks engaged with a heavy final clank. The download was trapped behind a physical barrier designed to withstand high-yield military explosive charges. The terminal was completely isolated, and without the physical data core, the download would automatically purge in less than 60 seconds. Valia stared at the impenetrable wall of metal, her royal composure shattering into pure despair. The evidence, her kingdom, and their very lives were slipping away behind an immovable object. She slammed her fists against the durasteel, a futile gesture against a machine built to survive orbital bombardment. Elias did not panic. He simply stepped up to the massive vault door, examining the seams where the heavy hydraulic gears locked into the floor. He rolled his broad shoulders, taking a deep, steadying breath of the hot, metallic air. He wedged his thick, calloused fingers into the microscopic gap between the floor plate and the bottom of the durasteel slab. Valia turned to him, utterly bewildered. She warned him to stop, explaining that the locking mechanism was rated for 500 tons of static pressure. A human attempting to move it was a biological impossibility. Elias ignored her. He planted his heavy boots firmly against the vibrating floor grates. The gravity of Earth was a cruel, unforgiving master that forced its children to build bone and muscle dense enough to carry the weight of the world. Elias closed his eyes and pushed. The heavy worlder musculature in his back and legs coiled with terrifying kinetic energy. His boots dented the solid metal grating beneath him. The veins in his neck bulged. His jaw locked tight as he channeled every ounce of his biological strength against the impenetrable barrier. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. The universe demanded that the machine hold firm, but Elias Thorne refused to listen. A sharp, terrifying screech of distressed metal filled the cavern. The massive hydraulic gears, designed to resist sudden explosive impacts, were completely unprepared for the slow, relentless, unimaginable application of raw, continuous biological torque. The thick steel locking pins began to bend. Valia watched in absolute paralyzed awe. The impossible was happening right in front of her. The massive vault door groaned, shuddered, and slowly began to rise. Elias forced the door up 1 inch, then 2, then a foot. The sheer physical strain threatened to tear his muscles from his bones. But he held the crushing weight with a guttural roar, turning his body into a living hydraulic press. He looked at Valia, his face flushed red with exertion, and ordered her to grab the drive. Valia snapped out of her shock. She dove under the massive suspended slab of durasteel, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. She reached the terminal, slammed her hand onto the console, and physically extracted the glowing data core containing the decrypted files. She scrambled back out just as Elias released his grip. The durasteel door slammed back down into the floor with a concussive boom that shook the entire industrial sector, permanently sealing the empty terminal. Elias collapsed back against the wall, chest heaving, his injured shoulder burning with fresh agony. He wiped a mixture of sweat and grease from his forehead, looking down at the bewildered princess holding the glowing data core. He managed a strained, uneven smirk, stating that he was definitely going to need a very expensive chiropractor when they finally got back to his ship. Valia clutched the data core to her chest, a radiant, triumphant smile breaking across her face. The romance of high society galas paled in comparison to the sheer, undeniable reality of a man willing to break an impenetrable fortress with his bare hands just to ensure her survival. They had the proof. They had the power to end the warlord's reign and expose the corrupted guild. They turned to leave the humming cavern, preparing to make the long ascent back to the diplomatic wing. But the shadows near the primary plasma conduit suddenly shifted. The heavy, rhythmic thud of mechanized armor echoed through the narrow industrial corridor, blocking their only exit. 6 massive figures stepped out of the steam in low light. They wore heavy charcoal black exosuits, their faces hidden behind featureless combat visors. Their heavy repeating plasma rifles were already raised and powered up. The glowing barrels aimed directly at Elias's chest. It was General Kalen's personal elite guard, the most feared shock troopers in the outer colonies, and they had not come to negotiate a surrender. Elias stood up straight, shielding Valia behind his massive frame. As the ominous whine of charging weapons filled the humid air, the most dangerous men in the galaxy had just cornered a heavily injured, unarmed mechanic from a forgotten death world. It was a massive, lethal standoff, and the only question remaining was whether human durability had finally met its absolute limit. 6 heavy repeating plasma rifles were aimed squarely at Elias Thorne's chest, but the only thing truly about to explode was a 1,000-year-old legal loophole. The humid metallic cavern of Sector 4 felt like a tomb, the air heavy with the sharp scent of ozone and impending violence. General Kalen's elite shock troopers fanned out, their targeting lasers painting a dozen bright red dots across Elias's ruined jacket. Valia clutched the decrypted data core to her chest, her mind racing desperately through the thousands of pages of Lyran High law she had memorized as a child. There was no physical escape. If Elias fought now, he would be instantly melted into slag. But if they surrendered, the data core would be destroyed, and Kalen would forcefully take control of the entire empire. Valia made a blindingly fast tactical decision. She activated her royal emergency beacon, broadcasting on an unencrypted station-wide diplomatic frequency that bypassed the corrupted local security feeds. Her voice rang out, echoing off the humming plasma conduits and instantly transmitting to every dignitary, council member, and citizen aboard Xylar station. She declared that the legally bound consort of the Lyran Ascendancy formally invoked the trial of ancestors against General Kalen. The shock troopers froze instantly. To fire upon a royal consort after the trial was publicly invoked was a direct offense against the founding gods of their civilization, an act that would brand them all as heretics and strip Kalen of his warlord title before the shot even landed. The ancient law dictated that a dispute of royal blood must be settled on a neutral, uninhabited battleground, entirely devoid of automated weapons, orbital support, or mercenary interference. It was a primal, inescapable duel to the bitter end. The Interstellar Council, awakened by the station-wide broadcast, had absolutely no choice but to authorize the archaic rite. General Kalen, his pride violently challenged on an open channel, was forced to accept or forfeit his command. Within a standard orbital cycle, the diplomatic elite of the entire quadrant gathered in heavily shielded observation frigates orbiting the designated arena. The chosen battleground was the moon of Varick 7, to the delicate avian and reptilian species of the core worlds. Varick 7 was a literal quarantined hellscape. It boasted a crushing gravitational pull double that of the capital station. Its atmosphere was violently unstable, lashed by perpetual freezing rainstorms and howling, caustic winds. The ground was a treacherous rolling expanse of deep, suctioning mud and highly aggressive, jagged flora. It was an environment designed by the cosmos to brutally kill anything not encased in starship-grade armor. General Kalen deployed onto the muddy surface in a heavily modified, mechanized dreadnought suit. The hydraulic servos of his dark gray armor whined in loud protest against the heavy gravity. But the thick durasteel plating rendered him practically invulnerable to the freezing rain and toxic winds. He carried a massive two-handed kinetic hammer, fully expecting to simply wade across the valley, find the fragile human choking on the atmosphere, and crush him into the freezing mud. A small, unarmored transport ship touched down on the opposite side of the blasted, storm-swept valley. The Interstellar Council, attempting to show a microscopic shred of diplomatic fairness, had provided Elias with a standard Lyran environmental survival suit. It was a bulky, highly restrictive mess of synthetic polymers, pressurized joints, and rebreather masks designed to keep his internal organs from imploding under the atmospheric pressure. Elias stepped onto the lowering ramp of his transport and tested the environment. The wind howled against the hull, shaking the small ship. He rolled his injured shoulder, feeling the thick, cold air rush past the seals of the suit. He looked out at the driving rain and the deep, dark mud. Elias reached up and unlatched the heavy, pressurized helmet of his survival suit. Aboard the orbiting diplomatic frigates, the automated medical alarms instantly went frantic. Council members gasped in absolute horror, fully predicting the human's imminent asphyxiation. Instead, Elias took a massive, deep breath of the damp, heavy air. The gravity pulled at his dense bones, but it did not crush him. It felt like a solid, reassuring weight, remarkably similar to carrying a heavy rucksack on a brisk autumn hike through the Pacific Northwest back on Earth. The freezing rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, completely washing the sterile, recycled scent of the space station away. He actually smiled. Elias systematically stripped off the bulky Lyran environmental armor, popping the pressure seals and letting the expensive synthetic plates fall uselessly into the mud. He stepped out onto the surface of Varric 7 wearing nothing but his standard canvas cargo pants, a black t-shirt, and his heavy steel-toed work boots. He did not draw a kinetic weapon. He simply cracked his knuckles, the sound entirely swallowed by the roaring wind. The diplomatic frigates in orbit went dead silent. They were watching a creature willingly expose himself to an environment classified as a lethal hazard zone, completely unaware that to a resident of a Class 9 death world, this was simply a standard Tuesday afternoon. Kalen laughed, a harsh, synthesized boom that echoed through the valley's external audio receivers. He activated his combat thrusters, charging forward to end the duel in a single, brutal strike. But the warlord severely miscalculated the terrain. The heavy mechanized suit, designed for the pristine, solid-state battlefields of the inner systems, immediately began to sink deeply into the unforgiving mud. The complex hydraulic joints clogged with wet, clinging earth. Every single step Kalen took required an enormous draining expenditure of the suit's internal energy reserves just to pull his metal boots free from the suction. Elias did not sink. He knew exactly how to move in deep mud. He kept his weight distributed, his center of gravity low, dancing around the lumbering warlord with terrifying, fluid agility. His heavy worlder musculature fired with perfect efficiency in the higher gravity, feeding off the rush of raw, natural adrenaline. Kalen swung the massive kinetic hammer in a devastating horizontal arc. The heavy wind and blinding rain severely threw off the suit's automated targeting sensors. Elias ducked beneath the heavy metal head easily, feeling the displaced air roar over him. He stepped inside the warlord's guard, driving a perfectly executed heavy-handed strike directly into the armored knee joint of the dreadnought's suit. The dense bone of the human fist connected with the intricate Lyran servo, causing the metal to buckle slightly under the unexpected biological force. A profound lesson began to unfold across the observation screens of 1 trillion citizens. True strength is never about the external machinery you strap to your chest, nor is it the entitled power you inherit from corrupt allies. Kalen was a product of absolute artificial enhancement, a tyrant entirely dependent on the stolen wealth of the banking guild to keep him insulated from the harsh realities of the universe. When his sensors failed and his thrusters clogged, he was nothing but a frightened man trapped inside a sinking metal cage. But Elias Thorne was a human. He was a product of millions of years of brutal, unforgiving evolution on a world that actively demanded resilience above all else. He was built to fall down, get coated in freezing mud, and get right back up. He thrived in the chaos. While Elias engaged Kalen in the torrential rain, a different kind of war was entirely silent. Valia remained aboard her flagship in high orbit, anxiously guarding the decrypted data core. But Kalen's corrupt guild allies were not simply watching the fight for entertainment. They were currently slicing into the royal flagship's communication array, deploying aggressive digital hunter-killer viruses to locate the physical data core before the princess could present it to the high judges. If they breached her firewall before Elias finished dismantling the warlord, the entire sacrifice on the muddy surface below would be meaningless. Down in the valley, Elias slid under another desperate, sweeping hammer strike, his heavy boots finding perfect purchase on a submerged rock. He looked up at the groaning, overtaxed servos of Kalen's mechanized armor. The warlord was breathing heavily, his suit's power core whining as it desperately tried to compensate for the mud and the gravity. Elias wiped the freezing rain from his eyes, his hands balling into tight, dense fists. It was time to show the galaxy exactly how a heavy worlder takes apart a machine piece by piece. 1,000,000 credits worth of heavy mechanized armor meant absolutely nothing when a creature born of a high-gravity death world decided to dismantle it bare-handed. General Kalen was about to learn a brutal lesson about the difference between purchased power and biological survival. The driving rain of Varric 7 washed over the battlefield in freezing sheets, turning the valley floor into a churning ocean of thick, suctioning mud. Kalen roared in pure frustration, his voice amplified into a metallic bark by the dreadnought suit's external speakers. He swung his massive kinetic hammer in a devastating overhead arc, fully intending to crush Elias Thorne into the bedrock. But the heavy gravity and the clinging mud dragged at the suit's hydraulic servos, slowing the lethal strike by a critical fraction of a second. Elias simply stepped to the side. The hammer struck the mud with the force of a small meteor, burying its massive head deep into the earth and sending a shockwave of dirty water spraying across the valley. Before Kalen could engage the suit's retraction motors to pull the weapon free, Elias closed the distance. He moved with a heavy, terrifying grace, his boots finding solid purchase on the slippery terrain. He did not aim for the thick chest plates or the reinforced helmet. He targeted the complex, over-engineered joints that held the walking tank together. Elias drove a heavy, calloused fist directly into the exposed primary coolant line located behind the knee of the dreadnought suit. The dense human bone shattered the protective housing instantly. A violent hiss of highly pressurized, supercooled gas erupted from the rupture, freezing the surrounding mud into solid shards of dirty ice. The suit's internal alarm screamed, warning of an imminent thermal failure. Kalen abandoned the buried hammer, desperately twisting his mechanized torso to swat the human away with a massive, armored backhand. Elias ducked cleanly under the heavy metal arm. He grabbed a thick, exposed bundle of fiber-optic sensor cables running along the suit's waist. Planting his heavy work boots firmly in the muck, Elias leveraged his entire heavy worlder back and pulled with explosive, raw, kinetic force. The reinforced cables snapped with the sharp crack of a broken spine. Kalen's primary tactical overlay instantly went completely dark, plunging the warlord into a blind, terrifying panic inside his own armor. The dreadnought suit, now leaking coolant and lacking spatial sensors, became a 2-ton metal coffin rapidly sinking into the freezing mud. Kalen thrashed wildly, firing his shoulder-mounted repulsor jets in a desperate attempt to blast himself backward. The thrusters ignited, but the thick, wet earth had completely clogged the intake vents. The repulsors sputtered violently, choked on the mud, and suffered a catastrophic internal burnout. A thick plume of black, acrid smoke poured from the warlord's back, signaling the complete death of the suit's main power core. The massive dreadnought suit locked up tight and toppled forward, crashing face first into the mud with a resonant, earth-shaking thud. The observation feeds broadcasting to the diplomatic frigates captured the impossible. The invincible general, the terror of the outer colonies, was entirely paralyzed, pinned to the ground by his own dead machinery. Elias walked slowly around to the front of the fallen suit. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his clothes were saturated with mud and freezing rain. Yet his breathing remained perfectly steady. He grabbed the heavy latch on the front of Kalen's helmet and hauled it upward, exposing the warlord's face to the biting storm. Kalen was pale, trembling with a mixture of absolute humiliation and raw terror. He looked up at the unarmored human standing over him, fully expecting a lethal, killing blow. He expected the savage brutality he himself had dealt out across a dozen star systems. Elias looked down at the defeated tyrant. He raised his heavy right fist, letting the warlord see the bruised, scraped knuckles. Kalen squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the end. Instead of striking, Elias unclenched his fist. He reached down, grabbed Kalen by the collar of his inner flight suit, and effortlessly hauled the massive alien halfway out of the mechanized wreckage. A profound moral lesson settled over the entire watching galaxy. True power is not the ability to destroy an enemy when they are helpless at your feet. True power is having the absolute capacity for supreme violence and consciously choosing to show mercy. Elias dropped the warlord back into the mud, turned his back on the paralyzed tyrant, and walked away. Kalen, utterly broken and humiliated on a galactic stage, croaked out a single desperate word of surrender, officially yielding the trial of ancestors. The return to Xylar station was entirely different from their initial arrival. When Elias and Valia disembarked from their transport ship at the capital spaceport, they were not met with suspicious guards or arrogant bureaucrats. They were met with absolute, deferential silence. A heavily armed escort from the Interstellar Council immediately formed around them, clearing a path directly to the Grand Diplomatic Chamber. The Council had already convened, a massive assembly of planetary governors and high judges seated in a soaring amphitheater of polished white stone. They expected a standard debriefing regarding the outcome of the primitive duel. They were entirely unprepared for the digital payload Valia was about to detonate in the center of the room. Princess Valia marched to the central podium, her royal silks replaced by the practical, slightly stained tactical gear she had worn during their escape from the lower levels. She did not wait for the High Chancellor to open the floor. She slammed the decrypted data core into the main projection terminal. A massive, undeniable holographic web of corruption exploded across the chamber. The air filled with thousands of glowing, irrefutable documents. Secret bank transfers, illegal weapon manifests, and classified communication logs between General Kalen and the highest-ranking executives of the Galactic Banking Guild hovered for every dignitary to read. Valia stood tall, her voice ringing out with supreme, unyielding authority as she narrated the intricate details of the conspiracy. She laid bare the plot to artificially crash the Lyran economy, starve the border worlds, and use Kalen as a puppet to enforce a 1,000-year corporate dictatorship over her people. The evidence was absolute. The digital signatures of the guild leaders were impossible to forge, verified by the station's own neutral master computer. The chamber erupted into complete, pandemonium-fueled outrage. The executives of the banking guild seated in the upper balconies attempted to flee the chamber, but the council guards moved with terrifying speed, locking the massive blast doors and raising their plasma pikes. Arrest warrants were issued instantly. The powerful corporate titans who had treated the Ascendancy as a disposable asset were dragged from their plush seats in heavy magnetic binders. Down in the holding cells of the spaceport, General Kalen was formally stripped of his military rank, his cybernetic enhancements disabled, and his assets entirely seized by the Council. The mighty warlord was reduced to a common prisoner, destined for a deep space penal colony. The political threat to the Lyran Ascendancy evaporated entirely in a matter of hours. The blockade was lifted. The rogue fleet swore immediate allegiance back to the royal crown, terrified of facing the same fate as their disgraced commander. Valia had not only survived the coup, she had surgically removed the cancerous corruption that had plagued her kingdom for decades. Later that evening, the grand chamber sat quiet and empty, bathed in the soft golden light of the station's artificial sunset. Elias and Valia stood together near the ancient biometric registry pedestal where the entire chaotic journey had begun. Elias looked at the heavy stone monolith, rubbing his still-healing shoulder. The mission was fully accomplished. The kingdom was perfectly secure. The debt on the Iron Horse was about to be cleared, and his Class A trade license was already processing in the Port Authority's mainframe. Valia looked at him, an unreadable expression on her elegant face. She carried a highly ornate, glowing datapad in her hands. The time had arrived to address the towering, undeniable complication that remained standing between them. The warlord was gone, and the kingdom was safe, which meant the blood pact, the permanent sacred union forged by accident and sealed by combat, now had to be legally and safely dissolved as originally agreed. Elias shoved his hands deep into his pockets, acutely aware that his part in the grand political theater was officially over. He was a cargo hauler, and she was a queen. The universe had a very strict way of sorting people back into their proper places once the dust finally settled. He waited for her to present the annulment papers, wondering why the thought of returning to the quiet, lonely bridge of his freighter suddenly felt incredibly cold. A fully repaired starship engine should sound like absolute freedom, but to Elias Thorne, the rhythmic thrum of the Iron Horse just sounded like an incredibly empty house. The grand coronation of Queen Valia was a spectacle that would be recorded in the galactic archives for 1,000 generations. The Starlight Pavilion had been entirely rebuilt, draped in the victorious banners of the true Lyran ascendancy. The High Chancellor placed the crown of suns upon her head, a delicate halo of woven plasma that illuminated her fierce, unyielding gaze. She stood before the gathered trillions, not as a desperate princess cornered by a warlord, but as a sovereign ruler who had navigated the absolute brink of annihilation and emerged completely victorious. The military stood at absolute attention. The remaining nobles bowed with genuine, terrified respect. Her future was secure, her rule unquestioned, and her kingdom finally at peace. Elias did not stand beside her on the grand dais. He watched from the deep shadows of the upper mezzanine, dressed in his old, comfortable canvas jacket, his duffel bag slung heavily over his uninjured shoulder. He knew exactly how the universe operated. The emergency was over. The biological shield was no longer required. The fragile, beautiful world of high society had righted itself, and a heavy worlder with a penchant for breaking priceless antiquities had no place in a royal court. He slipped out of the pavilion before the ceremonial banquet even began. He did not say goodbye. He was a creature of the deep void, accustomed to brief, violent intersections with other lives before drifting back into the dark. The Port Authority had treated his ship with terrifying reverence. When Elias walked into the private hangar, the Iron Horse was practically unrecognizable. The rusted hull plates had been replaced with military-grade Durasteel. The engine manifolds were sparkling clean, and the cargo hold was fully stocked with premium rations. He accessed the central terminal and stared at the financial readouts. The massive, crushing mountain of debt that had dictated his entire adult life was completely gone. The balance read 0. Beside it sat a pristine, unrestricted Class A galactic trade license. Valia had kept every single word of her desperate bargain. Elias tossed his duffel bag onto his bunk and sat heavily in the pilot's chair. He placed his calloused hands on the flight yoke, staring out through the reinforced viewport at the sprawling, glittering expanse of Xylar Station. He had exactly what he wanted. He was free. He could chart a course for the Outer Rim, take highly lucrative legal hauling jobs, and never worry about a banking guild bounty hunter again. He initiated the pre-flight sequence. The massive sublight engines roared to life, vibrating through the deck plates. But his hands felt incredibly heavy. A profound moral lesson often strikes when you finally acquire the exact thing you spent your life chasing, only to realize the victory is entirely hollow without someone to share the spoils with. He had spent his whole life running from attachments, convinced that the cold isolation of space was the only way to stay safe. Yet, the brief, chaotic week he had spent defending a headstrong alien princess felt more like a real home than the ship he had lived in for a decade. He reached out to engage the docking clamp release. A blaring high-decibel alarm shattered the quiet of the cockpit. The main console flashed a brilliant, blinding red. A massive station-wide override command slammed into his navigational computer, completely locking down the thruster array. The hangar bay doors, which had just begun to cycle open, violently slammed shut and engaged their heavy magnetic seals. Elias jumped out of his chair, his combat instincts instantly flaring. He assumed Kalen had loyalists left on the station, or the banking guild had sent a secondary strike team to silence him before he left the system. He grabbed a heavy plasma wrench from the bulkhead and stormed out of the cockpit, ready to tear apart whoever was trying to breach his airlock. He hit the cargo bay ramp release, the heavy metal grating lowering with a loud hiss of equalizing pressure. Standing at the bottom of the ramp, completely alone and flanked by absolutely zero royal guards, was Queen Xylar. She was still wearing the crown of suns, her majestic, shimmering royal gowns trailing across the oil-stained floor plates of his hangar. She looked completely out of place in the industrial grime of the cargo bay, yet she stood with the posture of a conqueror laying claim to new territory. She held a highly ornate, glowing datapad in her left hand. Elias slowly lowered the heavy wrench, utterly bewildered. He stepped down the ramp, the heavy gravity of the ship pulling at his boots. He asked her what she was doing in a restricted docking bay, pointing out that a reigning monarch should probably be attending her own victory banquet instead of harassing an independent cargo hauler. Xylar did not smile. She marched straight up the ramp, entirely ignoring the grease and the smell of ozone, stopping just inches from his chest. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with the same fierce, unyielding intensity she had shown when she first pulled him into that hidden antechamber. She informed him that the High Chancellor had prepared the official annulment papers for the Blood Pact. The legal loophole had been closed. The genetic registry was ready to be wiped clean, freeing them both from the accidental bond forged under the threat of a warlord's blade. Elias felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. He nodded slowly, keeping his expression perfectly neutral. He reached out to take the datapad, telling her she did not need to deliver the divorce papers personally. Xylar pulled the datapad back, keeping it out of his reach. She stated that she had fired the High Chancellor an hour ago. Elias blinked, his hand freezing in midair. Xylar stepped closer, her voice dropping the formal royal cadence and adopting the genuine, desperate warmth he had heard on the observation deck. She told him that she had spent her entire life surrounded by people who bowed to her face and plotted against her behind closed doors. She had inherited a kingdom of fragile glass, completely vulnerable to any tyrant with a plasma blade and a mechanized army. She did not need an annulment. She needed a partner who was not afraid to shatter the glass to keep the monsters out. She pressed the glowing datapad firmly against his chest. Elias looked down at the screen. It was not a writ of annulment. It was a completely new, highly unorthodox royal contract. It outlined a permanent binding alliance not just between the Ascendancy and the human sector, but a personal mandate. It named Elias Thorne not as a biological shield or a fake husband of convenience, but as the supreme military advisor to the crown, an equal partner in rule, and the permanent consort to the queen. Elias read the words twice, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that rivaled the deep space engines beneath his feet. He looked from the glowing legal text to the woman standing before him. The universe was suddenly no longer a cold, empty void. He asked her if she truly understood the immense, terrifying liability of permanently binding her elegant, pristine civilization to a mechanic from a quarantined death world who routinely used priceless statues as blunt instruments. Valia finally smiled, a radiant, triumphant expression that outshone the woven plasma crown on her head. She reached up, resting her delicate hand against the side of his rough, unshaven face. She told him that a kingdom requires a ruler to draft the laws, but it requires a heavy worlder to physically hold the doors shut when the darkness tries to break in. She ordered him, by royal decree, to permanently shut down his engines. Elias Thorne looked at the open hangar bay, the dark expanse of space calling to him with the familiar promise of isolation. He looked back at Valia, seeing the profound, undeniable truth in her eyes. The lonely life was over. The run was finished. He tossed the heavy plasma wrench onto a nearby crate. The metal clanged loudly against the steel floor. Elias wrapped his arms around the queen of the Lyran ascendancy, lifting her completely off the deck plates with effortless, terrifying strength. He smiled, a genuine wide grin that promised a lifetime of beautiful, chaotic survival. He told her that he accepted the terms of the new contract, but she was entirely responsible for paying his medical bills the next time he had to tear a mechanized warlord apart with his bare hands. Valia laughed, a bright, joyous sound that filled the empty cargo bay. Elias carried her up the ramp, his heavy boots echoing with absolute certainty. He reached out and slammed his hand onto the external control panel. The massive loading ramp raised and locked into place, sealing the iron horse tightly shut, permanently anchoring the heavy worlder to his new home. Thank you all for tuning in to another story. Dan here. And if you enjoyed watching a human show the galaxy exactly why Earth is classified as a death world, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. Drop the word Pact in the comments below so I know you made it to the very end of the journey. And please, do not forget to hit that hype button so this channel reaches more viewers who love a good, heavy gravity adventure. Until next time, stay safe out there in the void.